week, the experimental novelist Jeanette Winterson.
If Jeanette Winterson's dynamic mother had had her way, her adopted daughter would by now have been a famous evangelist. But at 15, Jeanette disturbed the members of their fundamentalist Pentecostal church in Accrington, Lancashire. She fell in love with a friend, a girlfriend, and after a great showdown was thrown out of the church. Her first and best-known novel, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, serialised on television earlier this year, tells the very similar experiences of a teenager also called Jeanette Winterson. The novel's both brilliantly funny and touching, even though the members of her old church did not think so. Now Jeanette Winterson is 30 and is published in 14 countries. After leaving home, one of her many jobs was as a makeup artist in an undertaker's. Eventually she moved on to read English at Oxford and is now a full-time writer. Her passions are classic cars and cats. She dislikes the present government, hates meat and keeps fit. Her two latest novels are historical fantasies. The Passion, published in 1987, focuses on two 19th century characters, Henri, a soldier chef who has a passion for Napoleon, and Villanelle, a Venetian beauty and a web-footed daughter of a boatman. The novel won the John Llewellyn Rhys Memorial Prize. Her most recent novel, Sexing the Cherry, which comes out in paperback this month, is highly experimental. It pursues fantasy, blurring present, past and future, and rejects any single reading of history or of life.
It's always difficult to describe your novels, because if you could do so in a few words, you wouldn't have had to write the damn thing. But it is set in three periods: the past, the present and the future, the past being Cromwell's England, where hypocrisy was rife and Puritans thought that they knew what was best and that people shouldn't go to the theatre, they shouldn't have any fun. There's a sort of new moralism in England at that time, a moralism which is quite parallel to our own now. So although the book isn't an allegory in the strict sense, it does have many parallels with the sort of thing that we're living through now. I think the important thing for me about writing Sexing the Cherry was to find a way about describing the big questions, the big problems that everybody faces, like love, like loss, death, how you deal with a society which is alien to you, and do so without being polemical. And that's why I didn't set the book in the present, and why I tend not to with my work.
But you have very strong political feelings, don't you?
Yes, I do. I'm certainly on the left, there's no question of that, and I care passionately about the environment, about equality, certainly about women's rights. These things matter. I don't think a writer should sit on the fence. I suppose I do believe, along with Shelley, that artists are the unacknowledged legislators, and that people take what we say very seriously.
But why work through historical fantasy rather than dealing with political questions now here in 20th century Britain?
Depends what kind of writer you are. I'm not a writer who likes to bring my audience bang up against the things that are confronting them in a very straightforward, linear way, because I think that clogs the mind. What I'd rather do is set up a situation, rather like Shakespeare does in the comedies, where you go to a place which is not your own, say the Forest of Arden, As You Like It, an environment which is unusual to you, and there you find out truths and understandings that help you when you come back into your own world. It frees you for a while from the problems of gravity. So you take things sideways on. You don't just come at them and get them hit on the nose.
Now that's rather a different style from your first novel, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit.
I don't think it is. I think Oranges appears to be set in a realistic landscape, but of course it's not. Largely because that landscape is one that most people never experience, in that people are not brought up as Pentecostal evangelists, thank God. And I think that was brought out particularly by the television series, in that it is consistently surreal and bizarre in the way that it presents events, backgrounds, people. They're all larger than life. There's something dramatic about them. In that way, Oranges does lead into the other books very obviously, in that I don't tend to deal with very small domestic realism. I tend always to try and look larger.
Now, I know you've said that you're fed up with being asked how much of Oranges is true and how much is made up, and I think probably you're at the stage now where you don't even know. Is that right?
It's always impossible to talk about your life in objective terms and to say, yes, I'm absolutely certain that this happened in this way. What I've done with Oranges is just to push that a little bit further and to so confuse real events, in inverted commas, and made-up events that it is impossible to say which is which. Can I say? No, I don't think so. And if a biography were ever to be written of me, it would be very, very difficult now.
Now, you call your main character of that novel your own name, and there are obvious, definite parallels. Like, I think it was true that you weren't sent to school until your mother was threatened with prosecution. She belonged to a very strict fundamentalist religious sect. She brought you up to be an evangelist, to save the world.
That's right.
Tell me what else she really did do.
Well, she taught me to read from the book of Deuteronomy, because it's full of animals, but they're mostly unclean. You know, these are not horses, bunnies and little ducks. These are hoopoes, pelicans and rock badgers and sloths. These were my juvenile menagerie, you know, the pictures on my bedroom wall. It's a different start for a girl. And certainly Mrs. Winterson was absolutely determined to set me apart, so there's no question of making friends at school, anything like that. I was called to be a child of God. I think from the moment that I was adopted, she was convinced that I would be a preacher or a missionary. And so I was given a platform from sort of an unusually early age, which did give me an enormous confidence and a sense of audience and of public speaking, which one doesn't normally get. And certainly those benefits haven't gone away. And I did believe until I left the church that I was absolutely special and chosen by God to do a great ministry. You know, there was no question of that, and this was bolstered up entirely by my mother and by our life at home, which was one of prayer and praise and speaking in tongues, you know, which actually seems to happen, and healing the sick, which also actually seems to happen. So I was surrounded by miracles, which I now can't explain, which certainly took place, and I suppose have affected me in the sense that although I'm not religious now, there is an important spiritual dimension to my life. And always will be.
What sort of miracles do you remember as a child?
People who were pretty damn sick, you know, got better, without question. I mean, these were not people who just came in with a few sniffles and walked out saying, praise the Lord. They were people with untreatable, uncurable diseases, cancers, multiple sclerosis, that sort of thing, and quite serious.
Who definitely got better?
Yes, they definitely did.
And you're convinced that it wasn't merely psychological, that a real physical as well as some kind of emotional healing was taking place?
Yes, I think the two do go together under circumstances of extreme pressure, and one of those extreme pressures is faith healing. I think that the human body and the human mind have extraordinary capacities, which we've not properly explored yet. And it seems that for us, in our sort of rational, logical way, those capacities can only be released through a kind of ecstasy. An experience which is not that of the everyday. Which brings us back, of course, to my books. That's why I write about those experiences. You know.
I think you wrote somewhere that your mother brought you up not only on the Bible, but on a version of Jane Eyre, and that this was one of the things that really got you into fiction in the first place.
Yes, Jane Eyre was probably my mother's favourite book after the Bible. However, the ending didn't suit her because she felt that Jane Eyre should have gone off with St John Rivers and founded a missionary colony in far-flung, darkest places. So she used to change the ending. And because my mother was very clever, she was able to copy the style. And so, and read it as though, you know, this actually was the ending. And it was only in later life that I realised, of course, it wasn't when I could read for myself.
So she had Jane marry St John, not,
yes.
not Rochester.
Oh, no, Jane couldn't possibly marry Rochester, the fallen man. She had to marry St John, the good man. Everything in my life was archetypal. You know, there was good and evil, black and white. There was no question of any middle course. Compromises were not allowed in 200 Water Street, Accrington.
Did that kind of shock you into realising that fiction was something amazing? That you could invent things and change things?
Well, I already knew that anything could be changed, but then I thought it was due to the agency of the spirit. What I didn't realise was exactly how constructed, how artificial, the entire world that we think of as solid and best loved and well known actually is. And it was a moment when I thought, my feet are not on the solid floor. You know, underneath these floorboards is the twisting sea, and at any moment I could fall through. And this was a sense of extraordinary chaos and also of exhilaration, because whatever walls there were in my life at that point fell down. And indeed they have stayed that way. Reading
Oranges, the amazing energetic hopefulness of your mother comes right off the page to me. Now, I can't understand how you could ever kind of lose it, how you could ever not see her for a while. Do you not miss her terribly?
Well, she's dead now, so I presume, you know, that she's busy doing something else in another place. Indeed, I had a dream about her where she was wearing white elbow-length gloves and driving a white Morris Minor with white wall tyres. And this was a great pleasure to her because she couldn't drive in life. So she was zooming about on the astral plane in her Morris Minor. I don't think I do miss her, no.
But you say that, but reading that book, it seems to me that there are whole layers of affection for her there as well.
I think there is affection, yes. And indeed, I've never thought of her bitterly or with any anger or malice. Rather, I sort of think of her as a far-off place that I wouldn't visit anymore. And what I hate above all is sentiment. I think the people who are the most sentimental are often those who are the most deeply unfeeling. And they cover up this lack of emotion with sort of mawkish sentiment. And you find it very often in families. People don't care for one another, but they feel they must pretend to. I think that's disgusting. I'd rather say, this bond is over, let's go on, than wallow around in the mud for years and years.
How did you make the break with her? I mean, it obviously was triggered by your friendship and love affair with a friend at the age of 15, which your mother then discovered. There was a terrific row. What exactly happened?
Well, I think because I've never been taught to hide anything, and because I've been taught to think that everything about me was God-given and God-guided, it didn't occur to me that falling in love with another woman was wrong. I mean, it seemed perfectly normal and perfectly all right, and not being a secretive sort of child. I just went around making this obvious. If you're in love, it's the most difficult thing to disguise. Almost every other feeling can be put aside and covered in convention. But love is too exuberant for that. And so I didn't get away with it. And naturally, this caused enormous trouble in the church. And it was offered to me as a choice. Either you give up this or you give up us. And so this is why in every one of my books you will find there's always, in the lives of my characters, a crisis point where they come to the frontiers of common sense, and they must either cross over into a world which is unknown and risky, or they have to turn back into what's comfortable and established, but what may no longer work for them. And certainly that was my crossroads and my crisis. And I thought, I must go on. I've been brought up to be my own woman. What else can I be? Don't most people believe that the power of what you know will be greater than the power of what is unknown, and that you can always be pulled back, into the familiar? And it's the way many marriages survive, isn't it? I've known this person for 20 years, I can't possibly run off. What's out there? Even though there may be absolutely nothing behind the front door. I think the pull of the familiar is very strong, but for me it wasn't strong enough.
In your next book, Boating for Beginners, you say at one point, or at least the author says, that every believer is an anarchist at heart. Do you believe that now?
It depends if we're talking about true belief or true faith, which I think is quite a different variety from the one that makes everything comfortable and nice and unchallenged. I think if you are prepared to allow into your life forces that appear to be outside your control, and God, however you describe her or him, is completely outside of our control, then anything could happen. And that's a risk that lots of people don't want to take on when they think of themselves as being Christian or religious or spiritual. It's not comfortable, it's not cosy, it's not peace, it's a sword. And I think faith, in that sense, may well change one's whole life, yes.
You said that believers are poets, and for them all things are possible. They're dangerous and mad, and reasonable people will never deal with their excesses until reasonable people find a counter-myth in themselves and learn to fight fire with fire.
That passage was written largely as a criticism of the fundamental church and its power to attract converts. It does so because, like opera, it appeals entirely to the excess of the senses and to all of the senses at once. And in a world which is cautious and mealy-mouthed and rather narrow and restrictive, anything that is pageant, that is glory, is going to have a devastating effect on somebody's life. And my sort of great stand against the sort of evangelical charismatic church has been that this would not be possible if people didn't live in such close confines, if they were brave, if they were exuberant, if they were prepared to fall in love, to take risks. So many of us, sit at home in the front room and say, I wish something would happen to me. And that means you're absolutely wide open, for anything to come along. And it may not be very good. I don't want to suppress passion, I don't want to suppress faith or hope or any of those big things because they matter. What I do want is for people to recognise that these things are in their own lives And that's where the challenge begins. It doesn't come from outside.
You do get across that feeling of safety that people have in those groups, that loneliness is no longer there, because there is a real sense of family in those churches as well.
Yes, there certainly is. I mean, there are certain good things to be said about those movements, and one is the sense of family and that people are looked after. Loneliness is horrible, and I don't think that I would be rushing around advocating it and saying this is a higher path. It's certainly not, and I understand exactly why people are drawn into places where they can feel warm and welcome. That's quite right. How terrible it is that only when we have a structure of some kind, like the church or like a family, can we give to one another in a way which is free and unexploitative. Why can we not give to one another anyway?
When you were a child, what did you make yourself of this God you heard such a lot about?
I suppose, although I was brought up to adhere to the Bible very strictly, God for me was not a distant or far away figure. He, and it was a he then, which is a great abomination if God is supposed to contain us all, was very friendly and a very close figure at that time. It was certainly later that I realised that if there was any God at all, that it was the God of the Bible was completely limited, and that the God of most people's imaginations was a travesty, because it was just a sort of big Superman, the need for hero, which everybody possesses. And I do write about heroes and hero worship a lot in my books, because I think it's something that we all have. Everybody wants somebody out there who's bigger, braver, stronger, wiser, to say, this is how you do it, don't worry. We never lose that feeling.
How do you see God now?
I don't think I do see God anymore. Certainly comprehending God is quite beyond me. I don't know if you remember, but Van Gogh used to look at olive trees and say, I can't paint them. These are outside my imagination. So shaken was he by the beauty of these trees and by what they could teach him. And I feel that about God. I can't paint God. God is outside my imagination. What I do feel is a sense of a great spiritual force and a great moving intelligence that surrounds us and surrounds this earth. And with that I feel constantly in touch, but I don't describe it.
What about prayer? Do you pray?
No, I don't. Not in the sense that I either go to a church or I sort of sit down and say, oh God, what am I going to do about this? That kind of prayer. What I do tend to do is praise a lot, because I'm always so delighted by this earth and by the things I find on it, that it's quite impossible for me to contain that. So I suppose, to some extent, there is always a version of my own psalms exploding from me, in response to this created world, which is wonderful.
Now, since Boating for Beginners, you've written 2 more novels. How do you go about writing?
I don't write every day. I tend to have an idea that works away in my head to such a point where it becomes uncontainable, and then I start to try and write it out. It varies every time. There is no rule for me. I never quite know how it's going to happen next.
Your novels don't really follow plots as such, do they? So
No.
It would be quite difficult to plan out a plot.
Yes, I don't think I'd want to do that, because if you can't surprise yourself, I don't think you're very often going to surprise your readers in any real way. I prefer to see it as a journey that I go on and that the reader goes on too, because I don't think of reading as a passive act. There's a relationship which must be formed right at the start between the author, the text, and the reader, and that itself is a creative process. You can never hold on to your work once it's in the public domain, and there is no such thing as a fixed text. It's always changing under your hands, and people find all kinds of things in it that you didn't know were there. It's sort of endless magician's hat. What colour handkerchief will come out this year? And I rather like that, because I like the idea that there is always a creative process going on. One of the things that distresses me most of all is that since the Romantics, we've had this notion that the artist is a lone figure, sort of staggering through a deserted landscape, and everyone else is sitting there gratefully waiting to receive the goods. This is simply not so. I think creativity is a mutual process, and if you don't have creative readers, then the best writing in the world is going to fall flat.
Do you need absolute quiet to write?
Yes.
So where do you go?
And I usually have to be by myself. I'm fortunate in that Ruth Rendell has a large house in the country which has a cottage attached to it, and I am allowed to moulder in the cottage, and very often meals are provided for me.
And she's writing her own crime novel somewhere else in the house?
Yes, Ruth's very disciplined, and she works, as far as I know, from 9 till 1 every day. I tend to work all through the night and flit about like a pale ghost.
And wake up late?
Yes. We usually only meet up at tea time.
You've said that the more confident you become as a writer, the more risks you're prepared to take.
I think that's true. It's important to develop form, to develop style. It's, for me, more important to do that than simply to tell a story, especially now where we've got so many other mediums with which to tell stories. You have to say, why is this a book? Why is it not on television? Why is it not on the radio? Why is it not a film? Why have you chosen this medium in particular? And there has to be a very good reason for it now, I think. And to me, a very good reason is to try and take the novel further, to develop it, to push it to its limits, to see what it can stand, to remove the scaffolding to such an extent that the thing might float of its own accord. This is my particular experiment.
Is there a danger that by watching it float that way, it kind of loses a rootedness that it needs?
Yes, I think there's always that danger, which is why it's important for any writer, but certainly for a writer who's experimental, to be able to describe things particularly well. So, for instance, in Sexing the Cherry, there's a lot of very sort of earthy filth, dirt and scum, as well as fruit, which is very sort of sensuous detail. There's a lot of physical reality which is described, and this, I think, does help to weigh down, to anchor a book which is otherwise floating off in very many directions at once. That's the best way that I have found so far to do it, to make things so visual, so tactile to the reader, that they know exactly what it is that they're touching, even though they don't quite know what it might turn into the next moment.
The historical fantasies you're writing now don't have anything apparently autobiographical in them. Is one reason for that the unease you may have felt at the problems of faction, that in a sense you are taking someone's life and then changing it so that neither you nor they know quite any longer what is real?
Well, I think that there is something autobiographical in all of the books. It's just that the lens is tilted rather differently and the filter is denser.
Looking back on Oranges, have you ever thought that in a way you may have treated your mother badly by the way you portrayed her?
I don't think so. I don't think that the mother in Oranges can really be described as Mrs. Winterson, who was and is no more.
But you have thousands of readers up and down the land who think that is Mrs. Winterson.
Well,
I mean, that must have been quite difficult for her.
That's too bad, really. I don't think it was all that difficult, in so much as she just dismissed it as the devil's work, which is very handy, so she didn't have to think about it. I cannot, apart from in my work, get inside my readers' heads and say, think like this. And it doesn't matter how delicate my instruments are, how subtle my workings are. It's this question again of receivers. If they're not going to take it as a work of fiction, as a work of the imagination, there's simply nothing I can do. People have an enormous need, it seems to me, as I do describe in Oranges, to separate history, which is fact, from storytelling, which is not fact. And they want to know which is which. And the whole push of my work has been to say you cannot know which is which, because you're always making up your own stories about other people's stories, and some of these become crystallised into fact and some of them float off into myth. But that decision process is absolutely arbitrary, so forget it.
Yes, that's a very Western thing, isn't it? I mean, you don't have that same sense in Africa, for instance.
No, you certainly don't. No. And since none of us can know what is safe, believable and comfortable, and since all the things in which we put our trust eventually crumble and are very often revealed as sham, then it'd be much better to accept that this is a roller coaster and that it's not solid, and that fiction is the best way of discussing reality.
Jeanette Winterson talking to Rosemary Hartill in Writers Revealed. The producer was David Coombs.